The 17th and early 18th century saw the meteoric rise of the Kingdom of Sweden from a small backwards nation to a great Baltic power. One young king, crowned at the age of 15, would lead this Swedish empire both to the heights of its glory and the depths of its defeat. Join with us as we explore the battles of the Great Northern War. After its crushing victory over the Russians at the Siege of Narva, the Swedish army went into winter quarters to rest, resupply, and receive reinforcements. Meanwhile, to the southwest, a combined army of Saxon and Russian forces, under the command of King Augustus the Strong of Saxony, continued to lay siege to the city fortress of Riga. Augustus the Strong, though the elected king of Saxony and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was unable to convince the Polish and Lithuanian nobles to assist his war efforts, and therefore had to rely on his native Saxon forces, as well as the 10,000 strong Russian force that Peter I had provided him. As the winter snows receded, King Charles XII prepared his forces to march to relieve the beleaguered city, which had been suffering under Saxon siege since the March of 1700, over a year earlier. The Swedish king planned to cross the 600-meter-wide Düna River just north of the city of Riga before striking at the besieging forces. And in preparation for the river crossing, King Charles sent orders to the governor of Livonia, Erik Dahlberg, to secretly begin gathering small river craft with which to make the crossing. The governor also secretly constructed a bridge across the Düna further east, which was finished in complete secrecy. The Saxon commanding general, Adam Heinrich von Steinau, guessed that the Swedish king would need to cross the Düna River and built fortified redoubts along probable crossing points. Though the combined Saxon-Russian forces numbered over 29,000 soldiers, they were dispersed along the many newly fortified points of the river. The Swedish forces, 14,000 men strong, arrived near Riga on July 17th after nearly a month of marching. King Charles wished to cross the river immediately in order to capitalize on the element of surprise, but heavy rains delayed the attack. Instead, a small contingent of Swedish cavalry was sent southeast to Koknäs to threaten the crossing there and tie down more enemy forces. The Saxon generals who commanded the redoubts directly across from the Swedish army were confident that their superiority in numbers and fortified positions were enough to defeat whatever the Swedes could throw at them. General Ferdinand Kettler even made a proclamation to his troops. Even a superior force of 300,000 Swedes would still not be enough to successfully achieve any progress with the crossing. As evening fell on the 18th of July, Just over 6,000 Swedish infantry and 500 Swedish cavalry embarked quietly into the transports that Governor Erik Dahlberg had gathered. The Swedish forces were now prepared, ready to force their way across the Düna River. Just after midnight on the morning of July 19th, the Swedish forces took 75 of their smallest boats, piled them with fresh-cut timber, set them alight, and pushed them into the river's current. As the craft drifted and burned, smoke billowed through the early morning sky, obscuring the visions of Saxon scouts stationed on the far side of the river. All through the night and into the morning, Swedish artillery on the far bank bombarded the Saxon and Russian redoubts, assisted by 4 floating batteries with 10 cannons each, and a single small 16-gun corvette. By 4 a.m., the first wave of attacking Swedish troops was ready to make the crossing, covered by the thickening smoke screen. After passing the cover provided by the island of Fossenholm, Saxon patrols began to spot the Swedish attackers, and artillery from the redoubts began to open fire, though with little effect, as the Swedish troops were still mostly obscured by their smoke screen. The floating Swedish batteries returned fire. At 4:30 a.m., the first Swedish troops reached the southern bank of the Düna River, and at their head was King Charles XII himself. Even as the first few boats of the Swedish troops disembarked, they came under fire from Saxon patrols and the defenders of the Geras and Balting redoubts. As the sun began to rise, nearly 3,000 of the 6,000 Swedish troops in the first wave had disembarked and were forming up. In response, the Saxon general Otto Arnold von Pekel launched his first major attack with 3,500 Saxon troops. The fighting was intense, but under the personal direction of King Charles, who had landed with his elite troops in that very first wave, the Swedish forces refused to withdraw, and after a few minutes of fierce fighting, the Saxons were forced back. Seizing the initiative, King Charles then counterattacked, storming and taking the Geras redoubt with astonishing speed, followed soon by the Balting redoubt. Meanwhile, the rest of the first Swedish wave continued to disembark and form up on the banks of the Düna. With the guns of the Geras and Balting redoubts now silenced, the Swedish engineers began to repurpose the small boats that had transported that first wave of attackers, laying planks across them in order to create a floating bridge which would allow artillery and cavalry to cross the river en masse. Still confident that he could dislodge the Swedish foothold on the banks of the Düna, Saxon General Otto Arnold von Pekel launched yet another attack, and yet again the Swedish forces would not budge and the Saxons were thrown back. By this time, the Saxon and Russian reinforcements were arriving from their dispersed positions along the Düna, and the Saxon commander Adam Heinrich von Steinau took overall command of the Saxon army. General Steinau, with nearly 13,000 troops at his command, ordered a third assault on the Swedish beachhead. His plan was to fix the Swedish infantry in place with his own infantry before smashing through the unprotected Swedish right flank with his own cavalry. Though Charles had received some reinforcements, he was still outnumbered nearly 2-1, with most of his own cavalry still on the far side of the river, waiting for the pontoon bridge to be completed. The Saxon forces advanced once more, and initially the engagement seemed to be going in King Charles's favor, as the Saxon infantry made almost no headway against the Swedish lines. But soon the Saxon cavalry struck. The cavalry crashed into the unprotected Swedish right flank with initial success, driving the Swedes grudgingly back towards the river. Recognizing the danger, King Charles rushed his only reserves, a detachment of 535 cavalry who had been painstakingly ferried across the river, to stem the Saxon cavalry attack. The Swedish cavalry flanked around and charged the far more numerous Saxon cavalry from the rear, halting their progress and eventually driving them back. The third Saxon attack had failed. At 7 a.m., General Steinau held a council of war, where he and his generals decided to quit the field and withdraw southwest towards the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Saxon forces launched one last, half-hearted attack to cover their retreat before slipping away down the muddy roads. The recent rains had muddied the roads and swollen the river, which slowed down construction of the pontoon bridge. So most of the Swedish cavalry was unable to cross the river and chase down the defeated Saxon army, allowing roughly 20,000 Saxons, along with King Augustus the Strong, to escape towards Saxony, while almost 10,000 Russians, who had been guarding other crossing points along the Düna River, retreated towards Ukraine, demoralized by yet another defeat. King Charles XII of Sweden had driven back the Saxon and Russian forces and crossed the Düna River. With his forces safely across the Düna River, Charles was able to march his army southwest and capture the town of Mitau, which contained much-needed provisions that the war-torn Estonia, through which his army had marched, had simply not been able to provide. With the battle finally over, the losses were tallied on both sides. Roughly 100 Swedish troops lay dead on the field, with an additional 400 wounded. As the day drew to a close, the Swedish army had captured not only a safe crossing into enemy territory, but also 700 Saxon and Russian soldiers, 36 artillery pieces, and 4 regimental standards. The Saxons had suffered far heavier losses than their Swedish counterparts, losing some 1,300 troops killed or wounded, as well as the support of their Russian allies' army, which withdrew eastwards towards Russia. Once again, the odds had been stacked against the young Swedish king, and once again, he had triumphed. With the Düna safely crossed and the Saxon forces in full retreat, a new opportunity presented itself to King Charles. The throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had been contested since Augustus the Strong's election in 1697, now seemed within the Swedish king's grasp. Charles decided to continue his march south with the aim of establishing a pro-Swedish government in Warsaw. But to the east, Tsar Peter I was granted the gift he most needed: time for his beleaguered armies to rest and refit and prepare for the inevitable Swedish attack. If you enjoyed this documentary on the crossing of the Düna River, please consider liking the video, as it really helps the channel, and consider subscribing so you won't miss the next episode of The Battles of the Great Northern War.